What's up and welcome back to MoAn Inc. If you're new here, then hello! My name is Erica and it is a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, I am chatting to one of the most highly requested guests. I mean, genuinely, it seems like every time I post a video, there are at least 2 or 3 people demanding that I bring this scholar on the channel. And not only that, but also previous guests that I've had on the channel, including Dr. Eckhart Fromm, Dr. Sophus Hell, and even Dr. Irving Finkel have recommended this scholar's book. Which obviously meant that at some point I had to listen to everybody. I bought and read this book and I was just completely blown away. So today it gives me great pleasure to introduce you all to Dr. Amanda Podany, the author of Weavers, Scribes, and Kings. Dr. Podany is Professor Emeritus of History at California State Polytechnic University, and today we're here to talk about her specialty, obviously, which is ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Syria. However, it will be a focus in this particular book, but this is not the only book, Weavers, Scribes, and Kings, that Dr. Podany has published. So please, at any point in the video, if you are curious not only about this book and picking this book up, but any of the other books that Dr. Podany has published, you can find all of the links in the description below. So please, please do not be shy to go and check that out. But with all of that being said, Dr. Podany, it is about time that we turn to you. And before we can get into the book and before we can get into ancient Mesopotamia itself, it is, I think, very important to always contextualize the historian, in our case, the ancient historian that I'm talking to. And I think it's always a good way to start us all off on the same page. So for you, do you mind telling us, I guess, really where this love of history in general started? You know, when do you have that first memory of really seeing history and being like, wow, this is really interesting?
Weirdly enough, it wasn't history, it was archaeology for me when I was a kid. I lived in England, grew up in England, and in the back garden, we used to find pieces of Victorian pottery, you know, and clay pipes. And we once found a stone arrowhead, which was exciting. And I just thought this was the best thing ever, you know, that digging up things out of the ground was what I wanted to do. And it took me until graduate school to realize that archaeology and history were so closely entwined. I was on the track to be an archaeologist. You know, right the way through school, I wanted to be an archaeologist. And then I went to university and I got an anthropology degree because I wanted to go into archaeology, and I got my master's in archaeology. And it was only when I started learning the ancient languages, which were required for doing the archaeology degree, did I realize, oh, wait, this is really cool. You know, finding the stuff in the ground is incredible, and I still love archaeology. But being able to read what they'd written, I didn't realize that's what historians did. I liked history in school, but it was all about memorizing. You know, it was all about Henry VIII and, you know, the Tudors and stuff. And then when I got to the United States, it was all because I was in school still, learning American history from scratch because we hadn't learned it in Britain. And so there was a lot of memorizing to do. And certainly wasn't my favorite subject in school. But when I realized what historians actually do, which is investigate and discover, then I realized that this was the best field, absolutely the best field. So it took me a whole sort of many years of really wanting to be an archaeologist before I became a historian.
So then what languages like came into that then for you? Because obviously your focus is in the Near East, but you know, were you exposed to all different kinds of languages and you got to choose, or was it because you were focusing on the Near East that then you were immediately sort of thrown into Cuneiform and looking at that?
Yeah, it was that. I had actually learned and completely forgotten now. I took a term of ancient Greek when I was in an undergraduate, and I loved it. I've never used it, so it's completely gone. But so I had an interest in ancient languages already. And when the language I was told I would need, well, I should talk about why I chose the ancient Near East, the ancient Middle East, because I was fascinated with all kinds of archaeology. And I initially thought I wanted to do British archaeology. And then when I got to university, I took archaeology classes as part of my anthropology degree. And I took some classes from this wonderful professor, Elizabeth Carter at UCLA, where I was doing my undergraduate degree. And they were on the ancient Middle East, because that's her field. And I was so hooked, because it was so ancient. You know, it's so long ago. And there's all these people with this incredible sophistication. And so that's what I sort of went in that direction because of her classes. And then I realized if I wanted to get a PhD in archaeology, I would need to learn some amount of the languages that were spoken in Mesopotamia. So I asked the professor of ancient language at UCLA, ancient Near Eastern languages, Giorgio Bucciolati. I said, you know, can I start learning Akkadian, which I knew was the language of Mesopotamia. And when I started taking those classes, it was so great. I just absolutely loved reading cuneiform and learning Akkadian. And then I continued to learn Akkadian, and I learned Sumerian, and I learned Hittite. But I was not in my field. You can either be in history or you could be in Near Eastern languages and cultures. And I was quite rare, actually, in the field in not going into philology. I didn't go just into the languages and cultures. I wanted to be a historian. So I got my PhD in history, which only required 3 languages instead of 5. So I did Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hittite, but I didn't do Aramaic or Syriac or Hebrew or Arabic, or, you know, there's a lot of languages people can specialize in, and I didn't do those.
So this might sound like a bit of a stupid question, but how similar are those languages? Because obviously, as you said, you know, cuneiform is sort of that general writing language of the various languages that you've listed. So how similar are they? Like when you're reading it, is it really obvious which is which? Are they similar enough? Like, I mean, a modern idea of this, just because, you know, obviously the audience are modern, but is it like Italian and Spanish, or is it like, you know, I don't know, English and Chinese? Like, how different are they?
They're very different. The 3 I chose are completely different, absolutely different language families. So Akkadian is a Semitic language. Sumerian is called an isolate because it doesn't have any related languages that we know. Nothing descends from it. Nothing in the ancient world was related to it. So it's a completely isolated language. Hittite is an Indo-European language, so it's related to English and German and French and Sanskrit and Persian and all those. And in a way, it was foolish of me to choose those 3, because had I gone into Akkadian and Aramaic and Syriac and Hebrew, they would all be Semitic languages and related to one another, and perhaps would have been easier for me to learn. But Sumerian, you have to learn. I mean, if you're learning Akkadian, you really can't. You can't not learn Sumerian, because Sumerian was the language that was the sort of original cuneiform language. And the Akkadian writers later used Sumerian as shorthand, and often would actually write whole sections in Sumerian, even though they might be reading them in Akkadian. So you just have to learn Sumerian. And I was interested in Hittite, even though it's not even vaguely related, because it was also written in cuneiform, but also because I was very interested in the era of the sort of middle 2nd millennium BC, which was the time of the Hittites. And so I wanted to learn that one as well. I haven't actually really ever used Hittite. I would be very challenged at this point to read Hittite, but I took several years of it in graduate school.
So then your PhD, just before we get to your book, obviously, it was the chronology and history of the Hana period. So just because I'm really nosy, and when I was Googling you, I was like, wow, what's that? What is the Hana period, and why did it really draw you in to dedicate all those years to that? Because that's still your specialty.
It is, yeah. It was kind of a chance, actually, because when I came back to UCLA and I wanted to do the PhD in history, Giorgio Bucciolati was the only person who could have directed my doctoral studies. And he was excavating at the time at a city called Terka, which is in Syria. And I went out on the excavations in my 2nd, 3rd year of graduate school. And Terka was the capital city of Hana. And so in a way, it found me. You know, I mean, I wasn't searching and thinking, oh, that one looks interesting. I was working on the site and I wanted to do something related to it. And so what Dr. Bucciolati suggested was that I would look at the tablets that had come from that site before the excavations began. So in the early 20th century, late 19th century, a number of tablets had clearly come from that same region. They'd been published, but to a greater or lesser extent in detail in a number of journals, but they'd never been looked at as a whole. And there were about 17 or 18 of them. And so what I did then was I found all of these earlier publications, and then I went around to the museums where they were housed, and I looked at them in person, and I collated them, with the exception of a few that I didn't actually have access to. And then I published those. At first I did my dissertation on them, and then I published them later in the book, The Land of Hana. So it was, as I say, it wasn't something that I went out and found, but the more I got into the subject, I am just so happy that ended up being my topic, because there were so many unsolved mysteries about Hana initially. The most important one was nobody had any real idea of the order in which the kings ruled, or even the period in which the kings ruled. They'd always been assumed to all be kind of around the same time, which was the late Old Babylonian period, which would be from, say, 1750 to 1595 BCE, somewhere around there. And the more I looked at them and really got into my in-depth study of them, the more I realized that actually they covered about 500 years, not 200 years. And so my sort of contribution that I was able to make, and this wasn't until after I finished my PhD, actually, it was in the years between the dissertation and publishing the book, I kind of really went into detail about the chronology. And once one had that, then there was all kinds of interesting things you could see about this kingdom, partly because it was so long-lived, and partly because of these many real estate contracts that survived from it, which was the main source that I had.
See, so that's something I've heard you talk about, was this idea of, like, you know, the land trading documents that you have. And throughout all of cuneiform writing, anyways, there's so much of, oh God, for lack of a better phrase, like the mundane that we get from this piece of landscape, which is amazing, because from my perspective, we don't get that from Greece and Rome. Like, we get the odd thing, we get the graffiti, and we kind of pull things out that way. And scholars have done like some incredible work to reconstruct the lives of ordinary people from, you know, various different periods of Greece and Rome. But you guys have so much of the everyday person. You know, why do you think more people don't know about that? Like, why do you think it's not as popular when you have so much about people who are just like us? And that should be really intriguing for everybody to read about, to see how people, the ordinary people, would be living so long ago.
I think it's partly because of the way it's taught in school, and even at university. One tends to get the big names. You know, you get Gilgamesh and Hammurabi and Sargon and Ashurbanipal and Cyrus. You know, they show up in just about every world civilization textbook. And so there's this sort of assumption that it's all about great kings, that's what Mesopotamian history is there's one great king after another, and maybe some minor kings, but that's what we know about. And there's very little in most of the textbooks, or even books that are written for the general public. There's not much about all of the fabulous stuff that we know, except in one crazy thing, which is the cult following of a man named Eonatsir. And this is crazy. I was unaware of it for a while, until people started sending me things. When Twitter was still Twitter, I would get these retweets about Eonatsir. It's like I had written in my 2010 book a little section about Eonatsir. He's got a page or two. And he was a merchant in Ur, and he's interesting. He had letters and contracts and things. He was interesting because he was a sea trader, and he traveled all the way to Dilmun. But it turns out that one letter that had been written to Eonatsir, which was a letter by a disgruntled customer saying, you sold me bad copper and I want to, you know, you're a bad merchant. This had suddenly taken off. Everyone was fascinated with the idea that someone in the, you know, distant past, almost 4,000 years ago, was writing a letter of a sort of a complaint that he wasn't being treated well as a customer. Well, Assyriologists know there are tons of these. There's like, that's what we have. We have letters by people who were annoyed about things, and we have contracts by those people. But Eonatsir, there are t-shirts, there's a whole sort of internet presence of Eonatsir. And the little tablet that is so famous, I was just at the British Museum last week when I was in London, and I'm standing there looking at the Eonatsir tablet, and a woman comes up with her boyfriend. She goes, this is it. This is the Eonatsir tablet. She didn't say his name correctly, but this is what she meant. And I'm like, yeah, it is. You know, I didn't stop and talk to her, but he's so famous. So that made me think that there is a fascination with this that is untapped. In our field, we write about this, but we write for one another in scholarly journals. And I think that the fascination with daily life and with the depth that one can get out of things like land sale contracts, you can find out who were the neighbors, who married into whose family, how they, what they sold their fields for. Oh gosh, all this stuff that I've done with the Terca material, you can do pretty much any archive that you find anywhere in the Middle East. If it's a personal archive, you can do all kinds of stuff like that with it. And that's what really made me want to write the book, the Weavers, Scribes and Kings book, was to kind of show that that's there, because I don't think people are ignoring it. I don't think interested readers who would read the Epic of Gilgamesh are thinking, well, I don't want to read about that daily life stuff. I think they love it. They just didn't know it was there, because it's not something that we as scholars had publicized particularly well.
Yeah, and with your neck of the woods as well, there's not like a Herodotus, there's not like a Tacitus, there's not like these big overarching, historians or histories in that kind of a sense, which we obviously have and we can look at and analyze in particular ways. But do you think then, because obviously with the book that we're discussing with Weavers, you go with a microhistory approach? So do you think then that your subject really suits that approach because you guys have such a plethora, and it's a much easier way to communicate with the public about your subject, rather than, we just keep saying, Herodotus said this, Herodotus had this interesting thing, da da da?
Yeah, I do. I think so, absolutely. I used to, when I was sort of starting out, I was jealous of the classicists because you have these grand narratives, and we don't know what the ancient Middle Eastern leaders thought was important in their own history, because they didn't write about it. There could be whole wars that we have never heard of, because by the first millennium they did, but in the second and third millennia they didn't do that. And we may be missing whole kingdoms, and we don't have the gossipy details that like Suetonius would give, that kind of stuff. That's not there. I no longer think it's a disadvantage at all, because I think in some ways the classics are so dominated by the grand narratives that there's a lot of sort of attempts to break free of them. We don't have them. And so we can do things like microhistory. And, microhistory is, it's sort of like biography, except it's taking a person or a small group of people and looking at them in depth for the period that they are recorded. And for most people in the ancient Middle East, we don't know about them from birth to death. We know about the time when their archive was written, and that could be maybe 13 years. There's a very famous archive from the palace at Mari in Syria. It only lasted 13 years, but there's thousands and thousands of documents, and there are thousands of people named. And all of them sort of fit into this world that one can reconstruct through microhistory. So in the book, I took a musician whose name is Bazatum. Woman, she was young when the archive starts. She was one of the small musicians, and you can trace through things like rationalists, you can trace her career. You can see when she got married, when she moved away, and then you've got this sort of way then of looking from her life into the broader world in which she lived. So even documents that don't mention Bazatum, if they mention musicians, we can look at, well, what was it to be a musician at the time? What was the position of music in the court? When she got married, what did it mean that she was the second wife of her husband? What was the situation of her status with regard to the first wife? She ended up being in charge of the weaving workshops of her husband's estate. So then you can look at, and weaving goes through the book a lot. So she was then actually supervising male weavers, actually male foremen of female weavers. So she was the woman in charge of the men who are in charge of the women. And all of that becomes this sort of fascinating little world in which Bazatum lived. And I think you're right. I think in some ways, because we don't have the grand narrative, we don't then have to fit that into, and then there was the Great War that happened in such and such a year, because we don't know. We know about her, we know about her little world, and it's I think really fascinating that way.
Well, also even like her friends, didn't she have a friend as well? And
Yes.
like you get to know like all of these really wonderful things about like their lives. Like, wasn't her, gosh, I didn't write this down.
Yeah, no,
Wasn't Baltani?
Beltani. Yeah, Beltani was clearly her friend. And at one point, when Beltani wanted someone to take care of her jewelry box, she gave it to Basatum to take care of. These kinds of details, I just find them absolutely extraordinary, because they didn't mean for this to survive. And I think that's what's so interesting about the documents that survive from Mesopotamia and Syria, is that they're written on clay. That's why they survive, because clay is pretty much indestructible, especially once it's been baked. And so in the case of Mari, for example, the palace at Mari, it burned down, and that baked all the tablets. And so they are beautifully preserved. But when the scribe was writing down the list of what the salary of Basatum was, or what rations she was receiving, he wasn't thinking, and this is going to survive 4,000 years. Of course he wasn't. He was just keeping track, for the sake of the administration, of what she was being paid. But the fact that it survives makes it possible for us to do this work. And that, I think, is almost unique in ancient studies, because very, very few cultures used inorganic materials for writing on a regular basis. They tended to use organic materials, and those disintegrate, which is such a shame.
So you have, I mean, so much material to work with, and so many fabulous stories to work with when you come up with the narrative of this book. So how did you decide the people that you chose to include? Like, were there non-negotiables from the get-go before you even started your research? Were there people who surprised you through your research that you were like, oh, someone gets bumped off the list because this person's way more interesting?
Yes, there were. Because I was asked to write a general survey of the ancient Near East, that was what I'd been asked to write by Oxford. I had to have the big names, so I couldn't leave out Sargon or Hammurabi, or the people who, if you have a passing familiarity with ancient Mesopotamia or the ancient Middle East in general, those names had to be in there. So there were certainly, it was not going to leave out kings. That was why kings is in the title. There are a lot of kings. But I also wanted to make sure that I included Enheduanna, for example, who is the priestess who is often considered to be the world's first author. She needed to be in there. I wanted to include a woman named Adad Gupi, who was this fascinating figure who supposedly lived to be 102 years old, and lived through such a remarkable period of history. So I definitely wanted her in there. But those are all priestesses, queens, princesses. I knew from the beginning that I also wanted to make sure the book had plenty of people who were not the elites, who were not powerful, however hard it was going to be to find them. And when I first wrote the book proposal, it's funny because just before we talked, I went back and looked at my book proposal. And I have people in that book proposal who definitely, they got bumped because they were not as interesting as the people I ended up finding. But the way I decided to try and identify this, it's almost 100, maybe it's more than 100 people who have sort of little sections of chapters about them, and sometimes entire chapters about them. What I did was I made a list of professions, because I thought that's going to be a way to try and address lots of different aspects of society. And I tried to find a person in each profession and spread them out over all of the eras of the 3,000 years of history I wanted to cover. So the problem is that there were, for example, lots of scribes, but you don't really need a lot of scribes. If you give the story of one and his schooling, you're kind of taking care of it. So a bunch of scribes got dumped. Tons of merchants. Oh my gosh, there's so many interesting merchants. One of whom is Ea Natsir. And I decided not to write about him. And I actually have seen a couple of people like, well, this book would be fine, but she didn't include Ea Natsir. It's true. He's in the preface. But honestly, I did write about him in a previous book. So I feel as though he has not been neglected. It was just not in this book. So yeah, a bunch of merchants got lost, several priestesses, so many fabulous priestesses, and I couldn't include them all. Tons of kings, of course, there's hundreds and hundreds of kings. I couldn't deal with more than just a sample of them. But I finally got this grid filled out so that I had every era covered and every profession that I could reasonably cover also on there. And then I had to look for what's been written on these. And so because I was writing such an enormous book, there's no way I was going to be translating all those texts myself. It's just absolutely overwhelming. And so I looked for scholarship in the field that had been done already, that people had already found interesting stories. And I took those and then I turned them into microhistories. So where they were often written as translations of texts that were, an analysis of the text or an analysis of a group of texts, I then tried to put that into the bigger world in which that person lived and flesh it out so that they would, drawing from lots of different sorts of scholarship and from primary sources as well, really making that person into a three-dimensional person.
Now, with the title of the book, Weavers, Scribes, Kings, we should probably unpack what those are, because lots of people who watch my channel are total newbies to not only my subject, but now also to your subject. So, and obviously weaving is such a big part of the ancient Near East and is very, very important with textiles and that whole industry. So do you mind just kind of breaking down why don't we start with weavers, like what that profession is and why it was so important to these people?
Yes, weavers, mostly women through most of ancient Middle Eastern history. And the reason that weaving was so important is that much of this region has no mineral ores, they have no timber for export, they have no spices that were growing there for export. And the one thing that became a very reliable export for them were the textiles that they produced from the wool of the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of sheep that were grazing in the regions around the Middle East. And these textiles were woven in different styles in different regions, as far as we can tell. And they were very, very fine. They took some of the textiles, we have records of them being made and taking months to make. So something where if you're taking months on a single textile and you have a lot of women working on it, it's probably embroidered, it has hems, it has fringe, it has, if you can, I always love going to textile museums and seeing the textiles from the Middle East that survive, from just the last 500 years. And you look at those and you think those are the descendants of what was being made in the era that I'm studying. And they're extraordinary. They're so beautiful. Think of the carpets in the V&A, for example, just absolutely beautiful. And that's the kind of thing that we have to imagine they were making. None of them survive because they're organic. So nothing survives of the ancient textiles themselves. So the ways we can get at them, one is in the documents that just write about the process. This much wool was given to this many weaving women to produce this kind of textile over this many months. That tells us something, but we can't see it. And the technical terms they use are often untranslatable. Then we also have images from especially the Neo-Assyrian period, the first millennium BCE, where they show the king wearing a garment, and the garment is embroidered all over with images of battles and flowers and all kinds of stuff, which gives you a sense of also just how extraordinary those would have been. And sometimes they even showed on the floor stone representations of carpets. And again, that would have been what an actual carpet would have looked like. So we can sort of get a sense of how extraordinary their textiles were. Then we also know that they traded them, and they gave them away as gifts. The king would give a gift of textiles to a king of another land who would exchange with him. So textiles were central to the economy right from the beginning, right from the very, very earliest documents that survive from palace archives all the way up until, forever, the textiles were important, but certainly through the end of the use of cuneiform, around the year 1 approximately, you see these references to textiles, which means that the weavers are crucial to the economy. They're not just sort of some enslaved women who were put to work. These are craftswomen who were true artisans. They were paid. We know that they were paid in grain often, and sometimes in the city of Ebla in Syria, they were paid in wool, basically, which they would then use to trade for what they needed. But they must have been really, really brilliant craftspeople. So I saw weavers as sort of this continuity throughout the 3,000 years I was covering. And also because I really wanted to make the point in the book that women were central to the society, the economy, the religion. They were absolutely central. They were not a sidebar. They were not, oh yeah, there's women, we should add them. All the way through Mesopotamian history, they were there, they were important. So I felt that weavers needed to be one of the key points. And I come back to them several times. So there's several points at which we revisit weavers from starting in around 2400 BC all the way up through the Neo-Assyrian period. Scribes, okay, now scribes are the only reason we know all of this. Scribes were literate, obviously. We know a lot about their schooling. They weren't many of them. It was never a situation where the majority of the population was literate at all. Probably the vast majority of the population was illiterate through most of Mesopotamian history. So a scribe had many roles. Scribes, after they'd been trained in this long, very detailed curriculum they had to go through, they could become the scribes who worked for the palace, who kept track of things like those salaries and rations and lists of workers and corvée laborers, all kinds of stuff, that kind of administrative scribe. They could be scribes who were hired to write letters by people who were not literate themselves, but wanted to send letters to family members, or they wanted to send a letter to someone living far away. There were scribes who became merchants, or rather maybe merchants who got scribal training, because being a merchant was their primary profession, but many of them did need to be able to write rather than having someone who they had to hire, because they did so much writing back and forth when they were on trading missions. You have priests. Almost all priests seem to have been literate. Diviners were literate. Officials who advised the king would have been literate. So there were all of these different professions they could go into. And then some of them seem to have become scholars who then trained other scribes and who kept libraries of their own and who engaged in these really interesting sort of intellectual conversations with other scribes. And they would write letters to one another. And so we can see some of this going on. And because they were teaching students, they kept alive documents from long before. And so sometimes, a lot of times, we don't have an original document from the time period, say time of Sargon of Akkad, 24th century BCE. We have almost nothing that was actually written in his time by him. Royal inscriptions by Sargon, almost nothing. But the later scribes copied those inscriptions on clay tablets so that they could learn them in school, and those survive. So because we have the scribes who've copied earlier documents, they are responsible for a lot of what we know about the history, especially about literature, royal inscriptions, things like that. Those were often copied by scribes. And everything they wrote, that's how we know. We have scribes to thank for everything we know that was in written form. Obviously, anything archaeological that is material culture, it adds to that picture. But names, places, place names, details of contracts, all of that stuff, and scribes.
So what you were saying though about women, that was something I loved reading about the book, was how many women there were, like that we know by name, but also what they did by trade. And that was utterly fascinating, especially that they were also involved in the beer trade. I have so many notes from this being like, excuse me? Do you mind like explaining that a little bit? Just because I thought that was utterly fascinating. I'm sure there's somebody else who just heard me say that go, huh? What?
No, it's true. If you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, going way back, there is a moment where Gilgamesh goes into an inn and he meets the woman who owns the inn, whose name is Siduri, and she gives him brilliant advice. I think it's one of the most important sections of the whole Gilgamesh epic. It's only in the Old Babylonian version. It's not in the later version, but she is clearly a wise woman. She tells him, give up this search for immortality, go back to your wife, your kids. That's what it's important to be human. It's important to enjoy your life. But she's a woman and she's an innkeeper. And that is not an unusual thing. It's not that was just a literary device. Even in the laws of Hammurabi, it's assumed that a lot of innkeepers were women. We also know it from, lots of other records as well. And then when we get to the Neo-Babylonian period, which is 6th century or so BCE, I was able to really delve into two women who were, one was a brewer and one was an innkeeper. And both of them were enslaved. They were both, they were not free women, but they were able to run these businesses and to keep a lot of the profit. Actually, they were officially the property of a man, but they were also really entrepreneurial. It was something that was definitely a female profession, and it's been often assumed that these inns were brothels because I think women were involved. And I really wanted to kind of unpack that and see if that was really in the texts. And honestly, it isn't. I'm sure there was certainly prostitution going on around some inns, but the idea that the reason that inns were run by women was because they were all brothels, I don't think the evidence doesn't stack up at all. People needed a place to stay when they were traveling, men and women. The inns would be those places, and the women, they brewed beer, they made meals, they had a place for people to stay. And I don't see the sort of one-to-one correspondence, every inn must be a brothel. It's the evidence really isn't there. I think these women were entrepreneurs, and it was a field in which they could flourish. One group of these women is particularly clearly not involved in the sex trade, because they were priestesses. These women called Naditus. Naditums. They lived in many cities in the ancient Middle East around the 18th century BCE, and they were apparently celibate. They certainly weren't allowed to have children, and they were tremendously entrepreneurial. They bought and sold property, they lent out property, they sponsored trading expeditions, they ran breweries, they ran inns. They were really a major part of the economy, certainly of the city of Sippar, which is where we know them the best, but probably at many of the cities as well, that in some ways, because they were dedicated to the god, in the case of Sippar, the god Shamash, the sun god, weren't allowed to marry. They were not therefore having children. They weren't tied to what all of the work that is involved in having children, and they seem to really run with it. I mean, they were very, very prosperous and entrepreneurial.
In speaking of that, though, the way that I phrase that is because I know from doing research on you, you actually gave sections of this book to your students to read as you were writing. And, you know, the reason why I mentioned the thing before is because that's what stood out to me was the beer trade. I was really intrigued by that. So was there something as you were giving these sections to your students to read that they had that reaction to, that you were like, oh, I didn't think you'd be interested in that. Let's go down this rabbit hole.
They did, yeah. It was things where, you know, they write in the margins, because I could only give them hard copies, because Oxford University Press didn't want me to be releasing PDFs that could be pirated. So they said it was fine if I just gave it to my students in hard copy. And so they gave it back to me in hard copy with comments in the margins. And I loved it when they'd write, this is cool. You know, there was one, there's a story in there in the book about a gardener who became a king in a convoluted way. And the students were like, oh, more, we want more about this. We want more about this gardener becoming a king. And the reason he became a king was because the existing king had a bad omen appear about him, and he was supposedly going to die. And so he stepped down from the throne and he made his gardener into a king. And then the real king died. And he apparently choked on something, or anyway, he died while he was eating something. And this king, the new king, whose name was Enlil, ruled for the rest of his life. It was almost as though, well, the gods figured it out, you know, and they clearly wanted Enlil to be king instead. And that was one of the things the students just said, oh, we love this. So when I got to the later chapters where I was writing about the Neo-Assyrian period, there's a king named Esarhaddon who did a lot of this substitute king stuff. He kept stepping down and having a substitute king. And in his case, he would then have the substitute king killed, and then he would resume the throne. Because I knew from the students' reactions that that was something that they thought was really fascinating. And what was nice is I was able to put it in the context, because that whole chapter about Esarhaddon is about the various ways in which the gods spoke to people as they believed, you know, how they thought the gods spoke to people. And one of them was solar and lunar eclipses, and that was what occurred when you would have a substitute king. But also there were all sorts of things, prophecies by people who had dreams. There were movements of birds. There was looking at the entrails of sacrificed sheep and goats, all kinds of things that I was able to also put in that chapter. But that was also one of the moments where, yeah, the students definitely had an impact.
Well, that element actually of that chapter was really fascinating, because I noticed that there was like not a distinct lack, but that you kind of moved away from the word religion in that chapter. You were really poignant about how you presented the I can't think of another word aside from religion.
No, I use it. Yeah.
But the religion of the period. Do you mind again, like unpacking that a little bit? Because I mean, that was really fascinating to me to see how, I guess, religion to us is kind of a word that's weighted down with a lot of assumptions to it. And so you very much went through it to kind of massage it out, going, well, yes, but also no.
Right. Because they didn't have a word for religion. They didn't have a concept, a sort of abstract of religion. It was how they explained everything. They didn't think of gods and goddesses as something you chose to worship. It wasn't something that you had a sort of revelation and went, I now believe this. It was something you grew up with from birth. And it was so much part of their world that the actions of these deities were you couldn't deny that they existed. And it's so hard for us to get into that mindset, because for us, religion is something, we know there are a lot of different religions. We know they have different beliefs, they have different dogma, they have different practices. That's the modern world. And if someone converts from one religion to another, that's a dramatic thing to do. You know, it's a really sort of life-changing experience. You are expected to do different things in this new faith that you have adopted. Nothing like that existed in their world. You didn't choose to worship the Mesopotamian gods. You did because everybody did around you. Absolutely everybody. There was nobody going, oh, actually, I have a different idea. It was how they, when they talk about the sunrise, the term for the sun was the same as the term for the sun god. It was Shamash. Shamash was both the sun and the sun god. And it moved and it had a life force. And I think that in their world, you would be crazy to say that's not a god. Okay, how does it move? If it's not a god, how does it move? It'd be like saying that dog is not alive. Well, that's crazy. The dog is alive. So is the sun in their minds. And I think for us, that is so hard to grasp, that it was such a given that nobody doubted it. And I've had disputes with people about this, because they say, oh no, somebody must have doubted it. You've got to have, there must be some evidence of atheists in this world. And I haven't seen it. That's not to say it doesn't exist in some text I've never seen, but I've never seen it discussed. I've never seen a sort of, here's our Mesopotamian atheist. They would sometimes feel very let down by the gods. They would feel like, I've done everything. I've worshipped the right way. I've given all of the offerings I'm supposed to give. I've said the right incantations, and my God is still ignoring me. Why is my God ignoring me? But not, I don't think I believe in that God anymore. It's always, what have I done wrong to make the gods angry with me? And so there is actually a whole sort of, it's not just me, there's a whole school of thought that we shouldn't call this religion. My problem with that is, what do we call it instead? So I do use the term religion, but I always want people to realize that it wasn't a question of a religion that you had to have faith in. There wasn't even any dogma. You didn't have to believe anything in particular. There was no such thing as heresy. You couldn't be thrown out of your religion. And they didn't recognize other cultures as having different religions. So if you were a Mesopotamian and then you traveled to Egypt, which they didn't go, ooh, all these false gods that the Egyptians are worshipping. They just believed that they were either worshipping the same gods under different names, like, Ra or Re in Egypt is the same as Shamash. It's clearly the same god. There's only one sun in the sky, so they just called it a different thing. Or that they had gods that the Mesopotamians hadn't yet discovered, and therefore, great, let's adopt them. That's, if it's a useful god, that's one that we might bring home with us, because it's something we might want to worship as well. So it's not that they were tolerant of other religions, it's that they simply thought of the gods and the divine world as one gigantic unity, and that every culture had some aspect of it, that but it wasn't as though they were different.
I think everyone can see how passionate you are, not only talking about your work, but just the ancient Near East. And you've done so much public-facing work, public-facing books as well, regarding this subject. So this is absolutely not your first rodeo. You've done, courses, even just appearing on so many podcasts and YouTubes and all of that. So when did that start for you? Like, when did you become so passionate about the public-facing side of this? Because obviously that's very different to the academic work and that whole field, to then say everyone else should be just as excited about this as we are.
You know, it goes back to when I was in graduate school. And I was asked by Gary Nash at UCLA, who's an American historian, was an American historian. He was running an organization called the National Center for History in the Schools, and they were putting together a curriculum for sixth grade. And sixth grading, which is 11-year-olds in California, is when they teach ancient history. And he kind of just found me, I don't know how, as someone in the history department who did Mesopotamia who might want to come to talk to some teachers. And I did. And I went and talked to these teachers, and I realized just how little there is that is available to them. And they're supposed to spend weeks on Mesopotamia. And they had nothing. And what they had was often wrong. You know, the things that had been put into the sixth grade textbooks were not necessarily up to date at all. And so I got sort of passionate initially about working with teachers on this. And I went off actually and did a whole 3-year, where I wasn't actually doing research at all. And I was just working with teachers. But also, actually, interestingly, I learned a lot from the teachers because they're great at getting, you know, at communicating in a way that professors don't learn. And so there was a lot of learning going in both directions. The professors were learning how to teach from the teachers, and the teachers were getting deeper content knowledge. Then I sort of, all this time, I'm still doing my own research, especially into the Kingdom of Hana, as you mentioned. But I got in, many of these things just happened to me. In 1999, I got a call from Nancy Toff, who was an editor at Oxford University Press. And they were thinking of doing a series of books for children, middle school, 11 to 13-year-olds, about the ancient world. And was I interested in working with them on it? Because I'd already worked with teachers. So I ended up editing a series for Oxford for kids, and also writing, co-authoring the book on the ancient Near Eastern world. And that just, from then on, that has always been a priority for me. It's always in my head that we need to get the word out to the world that this is such an interesting field. And it's not known. People know about Egypt, and they know about Greece and Rome, and they know about Israel. And Mesopotamia is sort of like, yeah, what, ziggurats, maybe, you know, maybe Hammurabi. All of this stuff that we, as scholars, know is somehow invisible. And so, yeah, I've been determined to be a public face of Mesopotamia for a long time. Yeah, and it's exciting that each time I've written a book, they found an audience, which is wonderful. And the course that I did for the Great Courses also. So it's something that I do feel really strongly about. Also because it gives me a chance to promote the work of my colleagues who are doing extraordinary research and deserve the credit and the recognition for it. It's not a big field. There aren't an enormous number of us. And I think that there's always this sense that the field is somewhat under siege because we have to justify our existence to universities and so forth. And it's an important work that they're doing.
Absolutely. And so when it comes to your book, and I guess generally speaking, the ancient Near East, obviously this is a fantastic place for people to start and for people to really, you know, get into this study. And I've spoken to, as I told you off camera, you know, Dr. Irving Finkel and all these people who, when I asked them this question, they said, you've got to read Weavers, Scribes and Kings. That's the book. So I've been so excited to then ask you, after people have now read your book, since everybody has recommended it, and since now we're talking to you, where do you think people should go to after this to really, you know, get into the ancient Near East? Like, what's a really good accessible, it can be book or, you know, series of lectures that you think people should jump to?
Well, honestly, I am not in any way alone in this sort of public facing thing. And there's a number of colleagues who are doing really excellent work, and you've named many of them. Eric Klein, obviously, he wrote the 1177. That's a brilliant book. Irving Finkel, anything he's written is so arresting. And if you go and look him up on YouTube, he is so fun to watch. I mean, I say there's not enough documentaries, but those little documentaries that the BM does, the British Museum does, with Irving talking about his field. There's one where he has a whole thing about how you play the game of Ur, the board game. Absolutely fabulous. I show it to my students every year, and we all play the game of Ur after they've watched him. So Irving Finkel for sure. Eckhart Fromm, you mentioned him. He's got a wonderful book called Assyria, which has come out recently. That's an excellent book. Marc van der Mieroop has written a book called The History of the Ancient Near East, which if you want a political history, his is the one to go to. There's a number of books by Eleanor Robson and Karen Radner. The one I love of theirs, it's called the Oxford Handbook of the Cuneiform World. And it looks at this whole issue of cuneiform and its role in society, and it has all kinds of articles by a lot of different people. It was edited by Robson and Radner, and really, really excellent book. There's a book that I hesitate to mention because I was part of it, but I think it's really, really well done. It's called Ancient Mesopotamia Speaks, and it was put together by Yale when they had an exhibit of their cuneiform collection. But in it, there's an article on food, there's an article on religion, there's an article on science. I wrote the article on kings. There are sort of articles on the big issues, the big institutions, and every one of them is accessible, and they're all illustrated with these beautiful pictures, some of cuneiform tablets, some of cylinder seals. That's a lovely book, actually, to start with as well. Oh gosh, there are so many. Elizabeth Barber's book, if you're interested in weaving, she has a book called Women's Work, which is excellent about weaving in the ancient world in general. I could go on and on, but oh, beer. You mentioned beer. Tate Paulette has a new book all about beer in Mesopotamia. That, for people who are interested in the history of beer, fabulous. That's a really good, a good start there too. Oh, and Sophus's books, of course, Gilgamesh and Hedwana. I will stop now, but there are a lot of really wonderful books that someone could find to continue their interest.
So before I let you go, I had one question that has absolutely nothing to do with the ancient Near East, but has to do with you. And I thought it was so fascinating. And I feel like people should know it because it also builds a bigger image of you as a person and of your career. And I did email you about this, so we got the all clear, guys. But I heard from a little birdie, Eric Klein, that you have a past of playing the bass for a band that also a lot of people might know before they were this incredibly big band. Can you please tell us a little bit about this?
Yes, I can. Okay, so I wanted to be an archaeologist, as I mentioned, from the age of 8. And I went to, all the way through high school, still wanted to be an archaeologist. And then I took a little side journey for a while. Because my dearest friend in high school, a woman named Vicky Peterson, she and I decided we were going to form a band because we loved music and we loved playing guitar together, and we just decided, why not? And we got her little sister Debbie in the band. Little sister, she's only a year younger than me, so anyway, she's not that little. And Debbie became the drummer, and I was the bass player, and Vicky was the guitarist. And we had a number of other people come and go, but the three of us were the core. And we played all around Los Angeles, all the way through college. So I was in the band for 5 years. So even while I was heading towards archaeology, I was still very much a bass player. And we had a following. We had a bunch of different names. And at the point where I finished undergraduate school and I decided I wanted to go to graduate school, I quit the band. And they replaced me, and they became the Bangles. So that was that was my.
That's so cool. Like, what?
Yeah, no, it is. It's very fun. And actually, Erica, since you asked, there's a book coming out in February that is going to be the first official. I don't know if it's authorized, but the first major biography of the Bangles. And I got interviewed for it. And so I am in chapter 1. And so I've never made much of a deal about it because it's like I have two worlds. I have, my academic world, and then I have this other bass playing thing that I do sometimes. And so I don't think most of my students ever knew. But yeah, since I'm in the chapter now, it's out.
Do you still play the bass, or is it just like, when you were in the band?
No, I
do.
do.
Play the bass?
I do. They have me back every once in a while. The last time I played with them regularly was in 2004. They had me back for a year, and I happened to be on sabbatical, so it was really easy. So I played bass with them for a year. That was very, very fun. And then more recently, occasionally they'll play some show in LA and they'll say, "Will you come play a song with us?" And I'll do it. So yeah, I still play.
Okay, you just saying, "Oh, I was on sabbatical, so yeah, I could go play this." I think that's the most iconic sentence I've ever heard an academic say. Like, "Oh yeah, I went to go because I was on sabbatical, so I could play this show. I just took out my bass, no problem."
It is very, very fun. I have to say, I don't think I would have survived had I stayed in the band. It is a very grueling life to be in the band, and especially when they were really famous, which is long before you were born, I think. But they were touring the world all the time, and they almost were never ever home. And we stayed in touch, obviously, through the whole time. Vicky has been my dearest friend forever. And so she would write me letters when she was on the road. And it was a life I wouldn't have liked. It really was. I know it's very glamorous, and I'm often asked, oh, don't you wish you'd stayed? I think I got the best of both worlds, because I got to do what I love, which is what we're talking about. But I also, every once in a while, get to stand on stage and play bass, which is awesome. So it's fun.
But you spent so many years then with them and on stage, and then you became a professor and obviously do all of these talks. Was there anything that you learned from stage presence from being in the band that you then took into your academic world?
Oh yes, absolutely. It was actually a revelation when I started teaching, which was 4 years after I left the band, 3 years. I started teaching as a teaching assistant. And I just loved it, because it's like being on stage. I mean, I shouldn't say this, because teaching isn't about being on stage. Teaching is about helping students learn. And I know that, and I love that part of it. But there is that sort of part of me that is a huge ham. Yeah, absolutely. I loved it. And also I didn't get stage fright, because I don't. And so I know for a lot of people, talking in front of people is very nerve-wracking. And I get that. It's something that people often hate doing. And I think because I was in the band, I never had that. I don't get particularly nervous.
So then, as a sort of last send off to everybody that has stuck with us for this nice little bonus chapter of the interview that I was dying to get to, what can you say to them that you wish that they knew about the ancient Near Eastern world? Like, just to kind of leave them on like one little note, what is the one thing that you hope that they can walk away with, that you wish that they knew, that they, you know, sort of like we were talking about that, the tablet of that merchant complaining or whatever. Like, if there's one thing that you're like, oh, they'll love this and they'll run with this, what is it?
I think that's exactly it, though, is that these were people who were just people, right? You know, we tend to think that the further away people are in time, the less somehow human they are, but they're completely human. You read their letters and they care about things that we care about. You know, they care about their families. They worry about their children. They worry about their parents. They don't want to get ripped off. You know, they go on trips and they get nervous and they get lost, and all these sorts of things come through in those documents that we were talking about. These documents that were really not written for the future. They were just written at the time as for a purpose. They were written for a purpose at that time, and they bring out these personalities of people that you can really feel for, and that you can understand. Clearly their culture is completely different from us. I'm not in any way suggesting that, oh, nothing has changed, but the shared humanity is really, really wonderful. And it's something that I think, particularly for the documents from the ancient Near East, they come through. And that's, I think, as good a reason as any to go in search of them, because I feel as though when I write about them, these are real people and they lived. And if I can do some small part to immortalize them, that's exciting. I love that.
Well, that is a perfect place to end, Dr. Podany. Thank you so much for chatting to me today. It means the absolute world that you took any time out of your day, and also were willing to work with the time difference between here in London and California. So thank you so much for that. And as I told you guys at the start of the video, please do not be shy to go down to the description below, because not only, as I said at the start, are all of Dr. Podany's books linked down there, including the Brotherhood of Kings and all of that kind of stuff. There's also links to the courses that Dr. Podany has taught, which are now online, and lots of my favorite videos through researching for this episode that I found, lecture series as well as talks and just podcast episodes. You guys can engage with so much more just by hitting the description below. So thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on MoAn Inc. I'll see you guys then.